Good evening. Good evening. It is a great evening, and it's a great evening for the second annual Daryl G. Smith Lecture in the School of Educational Studies at Claremont Graduate University. Daryl, will you raise your hand so people can see the person that is behind all of this? My name is Scott Thomas. I'm the Dean of the School of Educational Studies and a professor in the school. Many of my colleagues are out in the audience. Tonight we're here to honor Daryl's legacy in organizational change and diversity through her academic work, through her application, through her consultations, and through her behavior as a great citizen and academic contributor in a great field. And you've made tremendous impact on the way we think about organizations, Daryl, and the way we think about the role of diversity in changing organizations, and the role of diversity in rethinking about the ways in which we conduct our business in every kind of organization, higher education organizations in particular, and the processes that define the way we do our work and the way we live our lives in these organizations. And that impact has been tremendous. The impact is durable. And as part of that durable impact, we're delighted to be able to offer this lecture on an annual basis. Lectures cost money, and this lecture costs money. We're raising an endowment to sustain the Daryl G. Smith Lecture in Diversity and Education. I encourage all of you who are committed to the principles that Daryl has espoused and lived through her work and her life to make contributions to support this endowment. And to that end, I will match personally up to $1,000 in donations that come in over the next 30 days. So you can write to David Carpenter in the back up there. David, will you raise your hand? David will handle money transactions. You can write to me directly. You can email me, reach me after the talk. Jeannie Goings, who is always in the office at Education, will be happy to direct you to the right people to take care of this. But really, if you value what you hear tonight and you value what Daryl has done through her great work and her efforts across her career, I welcome you to join me in supporting this fine opportunity. So thank you for the commercial endorsement there. A couple of housekeeping items before we get going in the formal program here. First of all, some of you may be familiar with Professor Cecilia Rios Aguilar of the School of Educational Studies. Cecilia is a dear colleague and friend, and has made very important contributions to her work as well, but I'm not here to talk. Actually, I am here to talk about her contributions. Cecilia is a new mother, and a couple weeks ago, she had a baby daughter, Francisca Maria Saras. And so for those of you that know Cecilia, I wanted to let you know that she's doing great. Francesca's doing great, and we look forward to seeing them soon. Jack Schuster is in the audience. Jack, will you raise your hand there? Jack is a longtime colleague of the department and friend of the university and colleagues with Daryl. Jack has made similar contributions in the area of faculty across his lifetime, and we're establishing a Jack Schuster library that we'll be talking with many of you about your interest in supporting that effort as well. And thank you for your contribution, Jack, and it's great to see you here tonight. We have two events ahead of us. Actually, we have three events ahead of us this semester that I'll briefly tell you about so that you don't have to sit here in that awkward moment after the talk and let me keep you here from the wet roads. The first is on February 26th. We have our annual World Cultures in Education Conference. And Tom Lushai, will you say something about what we can expect at that conference?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. Yes, I'm very excited about this World Cultures in Education talk. The theme this year, this is the third annual lecture, the theme this year is Educational Innovations and Lessons from the Global South. So what can we learn about education from looking to the South and to the East? And our speakers will be our own Dr. Lucrecia Santibáñez, our newest faculty member, who will be talking about Latin America. A very good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Mita Chutkar from Michigan State, who's on sabbatical at Stanford this year. And our own alumna, Dr. Nancy Pine, who will be, Mita will be talking about South Asia, and Nancy Pine will be talking about East Asia and China. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I think it will be terrific. And this talk is supported by the generous donation of Dr. John Regan, so I will not be matching any of the... But I hope to see you all there and all your friends and colleagues as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. And again, that's February 26th, 7 p.m. right here in Albrecht Auditorium. If you're paying attention to our messaging, our website, you'll see that in late March, we will have our annual awards lecture, and we have the Casanova lecture, which will be delivered in later March. We'll have more to say about that in the coming days and week. And then in late April, we will have a panel on collective action in education and community-based education. And we will have several speakers, one from Say Yes Buffalo, Clotilde Decker, who is an important figure in community-based education in the city of Buffalo and in other cities in the Northeast. I believe that the Say Yes campaign actually started in Philadelphia, Laura, and I know Penn has been involved in that to some significant degree. So Clotilde will be with us. We'll have Sean Kanayapuni from Hawaii, from Kamehameha Schools, and Kamehameha Schools is a native Hawaiian schooling system in the Pacific, and they are involved in community-based education and change as well. And Sean will be with us to talk about that, and there will be a couple others that will be on this panel as well. So those are the lineup. That's the lineup ahead, the talks that are ahead of us in the coming weeks and months, and I hope I will see many of you there. Now, to tonight. Daryl, welcome. Laura, welcome. Daryl Smith. A lot could be said about Daryl, but my staff made me swear that I would not go over 5 minutes in this introduction. I'm already at 6. Daryl is officially now a senior research fellow and professor emerita of education here at Claremont Graduate University. Her real job actually is supervising a number of students who are completing their dissertations, but traveling around the country, meeting with heads of universities, heads of hospitals, heads of foundations, boards, faculty, all levels of constituents in these organizations to talk about her work and talk about their organizations and the way that they think about diversity in those organizations and how that thinking about diversity can transform the way they understand their processes and the functioning of those organizations. Daryl's contributions have accumulated over 3 decades. She has legions of successful students. She has transformed the way we think about education in the program here at Claremont, and the way we think about higher education broadly across the country. So it's an honor to be able to stand here and introduce this lecture, Daryl. Her research and publications have been in the areas of organizational implications of diversity, assessment and evaluation, leadership, change, governance, diversity in STEM fields, and faculty diversity. And you'll see her fingerprint everywhere on that. Last year, we had our inaugural Daryl Smith lecture, and we were honored to have another speaker from the University of Pennsylvania. I won't steal Laura's thunder by talking about Sean Harper, who was that inaugural speaker, but it's interesting that we have 2 people coming from the same program, and this is not a coincidence of social networks. It's an artifact of the work and the DNA of the program at Penn that is committed to many of the same principles that Daryl and Daryl's work touches upon. So it's a pleasure to have you here tonight, Laura. Laura Perna is the James S. Rippey Professor, and she's the founding executive director of the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, also known as AHEAD at the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, she is also chair of the Higher Education Division of the Graduate School of Education. She's a faculty fellow at the Institute for Urban Education. She's a faculty affiliate at the Penn Wharton School of Public Policy. And she's a member of the advisory board for the Netter Center for Community Partnerships and a member of the Social Welfare Graduate Group of the School of Policy and Practice. So you do a few things at the University of Pennsylvania, Laura. Laura is currently the president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, our primary professional association in the field of higher education. She has served as vice president for the American Educational Research Association's Division J, which addresses issues of post-secondary education. Her research examines the ways that social structures, educational practices, and public policies promote and limit college access and success, particularly for individuals from lower income families and racial ethnic minority groups. Her recent books include You wonder why I'm reading this, right? Okay. Her recent books include Understanding the Working College Student, New Research and Its Implications for Policy and Practice, Preparing Today's Students for Tomorrow's Jobs in Metropolitan America, the Policy, Practice, and Research Issues, The State of College Access and Completion, Improving College Success for Students from Underrepresented Groups, and most recently, the Attainment Agenda, State Policy Leadership for Higher Education. If you were to look at the recent list of people who are making a public impact from Frederick Hess and the Hess Institute, in addition to two of our colleagues, Margaret Grogan and Will Perez, who appear on that list from the School of Educational Studies at Claremont Graduate University, Professor Perna also appears very prominently on that list. And her broad impact beyond the academy is manifest in work that has appeared in outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Atlantic, Education Week. She writes regularly for The Hill, the Huffington Post. You may have heard her recently on National Public Radio, and so on. She's received funding from a number of agencies. She has a BA in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. She has a master's in public policy from the Wharton School. No, from Pennsylvania. No, I'm sorry, from Michigan. Sorry, Deborah Carter. I know, she's also from Michigan. It's a Michigan thing I have going on here. From Michigan, along with her PhD from Michigan. And I should know that because I've worked with Laura for years and years. Laura, welcome. It's a delight to have you here. We're honored to be able to hear your good thoughts.
Thanks so much for that very kind and generous introduction, Scott. I really appreciate it. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here today to deliver the Daryl Smith Diversity Lecture. It's, of course, always fun to have an opportunity to talk about your work. Sorry, it's like, yeah. But to have the opportunity to give a talk in your name, Daryl, is such a privilege. So Scott talked about some of the many accomplishments to knowledge of Daryl's work. Truly, the insights that you've offered for higher education have moved the field forward in so many different ways. I want to just take a minute to offer a personal recollection of how important you have been to me. So I was mentioning, and Scott talked about what my current research focuses on with regard to students. But when I was starting out as a doctoral student at the University of Michigan, I was working on a research project with Michael Nettles there, and my work focused on trying to understand gender and race group differences in faculty outcomes. And so I still remember the aha moment that came with reading Achieving Faculty Diversity, Debunking the Myths. So your work was very important to me intellectually as I was trying to get started. Around that same time, I had the opportunity to go and participate in ARA's Emerging Scholars Workshop. So this was after I finished my doctoral program. I was a new faculty member at the University of Maryland, and I had an infant and a toddler. And I was trying to figure out, not only can I do the faculty job, but is it really possible to be a faculty member and a mother with on the tenure track with two young kids? Let me just say the conversation at the meeting was very interesting. If it had not been for Daryl being there and offering her sage, wise perspective on issues that were really important to me, you really changed. The things that you said were incredibly helpful, and I carry them with me still. So thank you for your generosity in being there and the wisdom that you offered to me, someone you didn't know at all. And so I appreciate your kindness very much. It's an incredible honor to be here tonight to deliver this talk in your name. I also want to offer a few other thank yous while I have the opportunity. It's thank you, Jack, for being here tonight. So Jack Schuster was also, given the work I was doing on faculty, I had some connections with the work that you have been doing over the course of your time. And again, just generous, wonderful, small acts of kindness that made a huge difference to a junior scholar in the field. And I very much appreciate those moments as well. Deborah Faye Carter, it's so nice to see you. after all this time being doctoral students at the University of Michigan together. It's really a small, wonderful world. And Dean Scott Thomas, so nice to see you here in this capacity. Thank you very much for inviting me tonight. And thanks for being such a terrific intellectual partner and friend. I very much appreciate the opportunities we've had to collaborate together on projects over the years, and now Scott mentioned that I am president of ASH, but Scott is president-elect, and so we're having the opportunity to think together about the future of the field, and that's an incredible privilege for me. And some of the ideas that will be expressed in this talk reflect the work that we've done together. There are, of course, many other people, no one gets to any place on their own. There are many other people I could mention. I do want to mention a few people who are particularly relevant to the talk tonight. So Joni Finney is my co-author on the book, The Attainment Agenda. And so this talk tonight is focusing specifically on state policy. It was wonderful to work with her on that project. We also had three people who were then doctoral students who helped us tremendously with the work, who are now out doing wonderful things of their own: Awilda Rodriguez, Jamie Rorison, and Michael Armijo. So if you buy the book, you'll see their names in the book. Okay. Okay, so in addition to providing the opportunity to reflect on people who've helped me out along the way in giving this talk tonight, the invitation to deliver this lecture was also an important opportunity for me to think about how my work is appropriate for a lecture that's focused on diversity. So as has already been mentioned, my earlier work has included attention to understanding variations in outcomes across faculty. Today, my work really focuses on trying to understand how to improve college access and success, especially for students from underrepresented groups. More and more, I'm focused on the ways in which opportunity becomes structured for people within the systems in which we live in. When I talk about my work myself, I tend to frame my work as understanding how policies and practices promote equity and outcomes for students. But of course, at the core of any examination of equity is a valuing of diversity. The relevant types of diversity and the improvements in equity that are required also vary across national contexts. And so today I want to just be sure that we recognize that I'm focusing on equity and higher education outcomes in the US context. So much attention has been focused on the fact that the US population has fallen behind other nations in the educational attainment of its population. As I hope at least you can get a gist of from this figure, which is probably too small, and I apologize for that, the US leads the world in terms of the share of its population aged 45 to 54 that holds a bachelor's type of credential. But in terms of the educational attainment of younger adults, so here aged 25 to 34, the US now lags other nations. So in 2007, the percentage of adults aged 25 to 34 with at least a bachelor's type of credential was lower in the US than in Norway, the Netherlands, Korea, New Zealand, and Denmark. Of course, attention only to the nation's overall level of attainment masks important differences across groups. In the US, as many of us know and have lived, there are considerable differences across groups in a whole host of college-related outcomes. One of the points that Joni and I argue in the book is that the US cannot achieve the levels of educational attainment that are required for international competitiveness unless we close these gaps across groups. I've included just a few of the many slides here that could be used to describe gaps or differences in attainment across different demographic groups in the US. So here we see that educational attainment is considerably lower for Hispanics and Blacks than for whites and Asians. So only 13% of Hispanics and 17% of Blacks aged 25 and older have at least a bachelor's degree, compared with 30% of whites and 50% of Asians. One of the reasons why paying attention to race ethnicity matters is because of the changing demographic characteristics of our population. So here we see the change over time, the decline really in the share of the population that's white and the growing share of the population that's Hispanic. So by the middle of the next decade or so, whites will represent no more than half of the nation's public high school graduates. And as I'm sure you know, in some states like California are already majority minority. So clearly the US cannot achieve the levels of educational attainment that's required for our national competitiveness or workforce readiness without paying greater attention to demographic trends. Educational attainment also varies based on other characteristics. So here we see differences in educational attainment by gender. In 1980, a higher share of men than women completed at least a bachelor's degree, and today the reverse is true, so a higher share of women than men. Within racial ethnic groups, there are also differences in attainment by gender. So here we see the lower rates of attainment for men than for women, regardless of race, ethnicity. And I think particularly important is to pay attention to the relatively low rates of attainment for Black men and Hispanic men. So how do we improve educational attainment? Well, one of the challenges, I think, is to recognize that the degree attainment that I just showed, for example, is the result of a longitudinal and cumulative process. This process arguably begins at birth, given the ways that educational attainment and opportunity are structured into our society. So looking only at college-related parts of this educational attainment pipeline, here we see differences in college enrollment based on family income. There's a general upward trend, especially for folks in the lowest two family income quintiles. But even with these improvements, considerable gaps in college enrollment persist over time. And this is not without tremendous intervention. So we're investing a lot of money in trying to close gaps. It's remarkable to me how wide the gaps continue to be. So in 2012, college enrollment rates were about 30 percentage points lower for those in the lowest income quintile than for those in the highest. In the US, it also matters not only whether you go to college, but also where you go to college. Simply enrolling in college is not enough. So here we see considerable variation across income groups in terms of the type of post-secondary educational institution that folks attend. So for example, students from the lowest family income quartile represent about half, 45% of dependent students attending for-profit institutions. In contrast, less than a fifth, 18% of students attending private, not-for-profit, four-year institutions are from the lowest family income. And if we were to look at even the most selective institutions within the private, not-for-profit sector there, the share would be even lower. Family income is also related to the likelihood of completion, even among those who enroll. This slide shows that nationwide, more than half, about 58%, of dependent students from the highest family income quartile who first enrolled in college in 2003-04 completed a bachelor's degree within 5 years. So 58% compared with just 26% of those from the lowest family income quartile. Okay, so we have these important differences in different outcomes along the way. Why does it really matter? So why does it matter that the US has fallen behind other nations? Do we need to improve this only so that the US can be number one? Here, as I'm sure that you know, higher education is associated with a whole host of different types of benefits. One reason why completion of higher education is more important now than ever before, I think, is because of this increase in earnings premium that's associated with completing at least a bachelor's degree. So here you see the upward trending line in earnings for those who have a bachelor's degree or more, and the flat and even declining line for folks who have lower levels of education. So because of the continued differences in attainment that I showed you before, the countless benefits of higher education, and again, this is just only one of those benefits, are unequally distributed across our population. So there's an important social justice component to this argument as well. It's important to recognize why earnings are increasing for those who have more education, and one reason has to do with the increasing level of skill that's required for available jobs. So based on their analysis of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Carnevale and colleagues report that in 1973, about 72% of all available jobs required no more than high school. They project, in contrast, by 2018, that only 38% of all jobs will be available to those who have no more than high school. So in other words, 62% of the available jobs by 2018 will require some post-secondary education. They further project in this report that at the current rate of degree production, the demand for workers with at least an associate's degree will exceed the supply by 3 million by 2018. Okay, so how do we increase higher education attainment, and how do we close gaps in higher education attainment across groups? At the crux of the research that I've conducted today, I've really assumed that at the core of the college enrollment decision is a human capital theory perspective. So students are weighing the costs with the benefits. Human capital theory assumes that students weigh the benefits based on their perceptions of their academic readiness to succeed in college and the likelihood that they'll complete a program. Human capital theory also assumes that they consider their perceptions of earnings after finishing. Cost calculations are also, again, based on perception. So human capital theory doesn't assume that folks have perfect and complete information and knowledge about all the benefits and the costs, only that they use the information that they have. My and others' work have also emphasized and really tried to explore how people acquire the information that they have in order to make these decisions. And so a central premise of this is that people make decisions based on the context in which they're embedded in. And so students are embedded in a whole host of different contexts. The context of their family, the characteristics of their family influence their decisions. The characteristics of the high schools that they attend matter. And the characteristics of the states that they live in also matter, given variations in different policies with regard to financial aid, different policies regarding tuition, and different policies with regard to academic readiness for college. So there's certainly a lot that matters in terms of different types of policy and different types of contexts. Tonight, for the rest of the talk, I want to focus specifically on the role of the state context and the role of state context in increasing attainment overall, as well as closing gaps in attainment across groups. So clearly other policies and practices matter, but Joni and I argue in the book that focusing on state policy is particularly important for a few reasons. So in the US, each state has developed its own system or approach to higher education. And each state also has a whole host of different policies and practices regarding all aspects of higher education, so funding and governing higher education, the ways in which higher education is connected to K through 12 schools, and the ways in which higher education is related to other state goals. From a research perspective, focusing on states is also interesting because of the great differences across states in terms of educational attainment. So one of the points that we try to make in the book is that, so much of our attention focuses on differences in outcomes across demographic characteristics. We also find that your educational attainment varies based on where you live. So here you see differences in attainment across states. If you probe within states, you see differences in attainment based on where you happen to live within a state as well. So there's clearly tremendous variation. This is the share of adults who have attained at least an associate's degree. At one end of the continuum, about 45% of adults have at least an associate's degree in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. At the other end of the continuum, less than 30% of adults have at least an associate's degree in Mississippi, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arkansas, and West Virginia. So what do we know about the role of state policy in improving higher education attainment and closing gaps in attainment across groups? So one of the foundations for our work was the Measuring Up report card that was produced by the National Center for Public Policy in Higher Education. So my collaborator, Joni Finney, who's now at Penn, was formerly at the National Center for Public Policy in Higher Education. And she was one of the architects with Pat Callan of this report. I think this report was really important in terms of changing our understanding of how we think about measuring performance of states and what's important. So it's very outcome focused. It gave states grades on different aspects of performance, so preparation for college, participation in college, completion of college, and affordability. Measuring Up also focused attention on the states as the unit of analysis. And so what it did basically was give states grades in each of those categories. The reports were conducted every other year between 2000 and 2008, and so together the reports show interesting trends over time in the grades that states got. So that was an important contribution. One limitation was, though, it did not explain, well, why does one state get an A in a particular category and another state scores lower, and what contributes to changes in grades over time. And so that's really what we tried to do in our study. We're trying to understand what explains higher education performance as a way of trying to understand, well, what can states do better in order to improve attainment and close gaps in attainment across groups. So I want to tell you just briefly about what it is that we did. So we conducted case studies of 5 states: Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Texas, and Washington. We collected a whole host of data, as summarized here, and then we produced state reports for each state, and then looked across states to find the common lessons. We were trying to understand changes in performance between the early 1990s until about 2010. It's important to note, so we were collecting data beginning in 2008, which was the height of the recession. And so very interesting to go into these states at that particular time to try to understand how states were dealing with that particular economic time and how states were making decisions or not about how to use the resources that we have. We talked to a whole bunch of people within each state, and so this slide just gives you a sense of that. We talked to folks who held leadership positions in higher education within each state, political leaders, presidents of universities, folks at the K through 12 on that bridging point between K through 12 and higher education, and then other relevant stakeholders in each state. So in terms of how our study contributes to the understanding, the body of knowledge on these topics, we identified 3 categories of literature that was out there that's relevant to understanding the role of state policy. There's one category of studies, and I've conducted some, and Scott and others have, where we're trying to isolate the effects of a particular policy on a particular outcome. So modeling statistically, what's the effect of need-based financial aid on enrollment in a 4-year institution after graduating from high school, holding other things constant. So that tells you something about particular policies. There's also a category of literature that's out there trying to understand the determinants of public policy adoption. So for example, why do states adopt a merit-based financial aid program, for example? What are the political forces that contribute that way? And so that's certainly an important part of the process. There's also then a third category of studies that are, and this is where we would position ours, I think, is around state case studies. And there have been a series of those that are out there. Dick Richardson and Mario Martinez had a book that came out pretty much right after our study started. It was published in 2009, and they also did case studies of states. And what I think their work was very helpful to us in trying to understand the ways in which states make policy with regard to higher education. One difference is that they try to identify some specific types of policies that matter. So they come out and identify 23 different types of practices that matter. Our study tries to step back and think about what are the ways in which policies interact with each other within those states, and provides a more conceptual type of approach of why public policy matters and what is the way in which policy leadership interacts with particular policies. Okay, so just a word about the states. So certainly 5 states cannot represent all 50 states. You know, we have tremendous variation, as you saw earlier, in educational attainment. We tried to pick 5 states that we thought were important states to understand. So we selected them based on a number of criteria. They have variation in performance, both in terms of current performance and trends over time. They also vary in terms of demographic characteristics. So it was really important for us to have states that reflected diverse populations. Here you see that in Georgia and Maryland, African Americans are a high share of the population. Texas has a high share of Latinos. And all 5 of the states are projected to have considerable growth in the Latino population moving forward. It was also important to us to select states that enroll a fair share of their students in community colleges. So given our interest in trying to understand how to improve equity and try to provide and understand the role of state policy in improving attainment for groups that have been historically underrepresented in higher education, attention to community colleges is really important. And so here you can see community colleges played an important role in our states. And then again, all states, you know, again, the fiscal time of the study was important. So all 5 states at the time of our study were experiencing considerable fiscal stress. One of the conclusions that we try to stress, though, is that even before the economic downturn, all states were experiencing challenges with performance. So figuring out how to use resources better is one of the themes that we try to talk about throughout the book. Okay, so what did we find? So these headlines perhaps give you a sense of the state-specific stories. And as you might infer here, they're quite different. So I'll provide you just a little bit of information. There's more detail in the book, of course. But so in Georgia, perpetuating disparity. So Georgia was the most depressing. Anybody from Georgia here? Georgia, of the 5 states, so below the national average on the measures of preparation, participation, affordability that we looked at. Considerably lower performance for the large segment of its population, that's African American, and the growing Hispanic population. Regressive financial aid policies, so the Hope Scholarship Program rewarding financial aid based on academic merit, but other mechanisms in place. So Georgia, in terms of a strength, has a high production of workforce certificates and enrolls a fair number of students in its technical colleges. The challenge at the time we were there is that if you went the technical college route, very limited ability to transfer to a degree granting program, some structural mechanisms that limited crossover of path that way. Illinois, story of decline. So Illinois was a top performer in the early 1990s, and when you look at the early measuring up reports, Illinois is one of those states that that stood out as a leader. Declining performance through 2008. Also large regional disparities, so considerably lower attainment in Chicago than the rest of the state, and differences manifested along racial ethnic lines within that. One of the observations with Illinois had to do with a change in governance structure, and so one of the conclusions from our book has to do with the mechanisms that are in place to help guide higher education institutions. And so Illinois moved from it was called the system of systems, so a way of coordinating higher education institutions in the state to a more decentralized type of approach. Also, Illinois faced some challenges with regard to the political leadership, so governors facing challenges around corruption, and at best we could call it political indifference towards higher education in the state. Also, Illinois experienced an unraveling of the financial aid policies in place. So Illinois had started in the early 1990s with a very large and well-regarded state need-based program, and that was experienced some declines over time. Maryland was our bright star of the 5. So Maryland is a top performer in most aspects of performance, but still gaps across groups. So considerably, remember, if you recall that earlier slide, African Americans are a considerable share of the population in Maryland, and lower performance for African Americans than for whites. Also, lingering questions with regard to the historically black colleges in the state. And so in particular, at the time of our study, challenges to the role of Morgan State University within the system. On the plus side, some of what was happening there in Maryland is contextual, right? So strong executive and political leadership, which may be easier in a small state like Maryland, and a strong tradition of having elected leaders who have ties to education. Maryland also, in terms of policy, though, had developed a comprehensive plan for financing higher education into the future with some explicit links between tuition policy, financial aid, and family income. Texas, hard choices ahead. So Texas also below the national average in terms of most indicators of performance, but seemed to be making some improvements over time. Still inequities in performance, so considerably lower attainment and indicators for the large and growing Latino population in the state. In Texas, we did find broader political and business consensus on statewide goals for higher education. So Texas, at the time of our study, had a master plan called Closing the Gaps. And that was a plan that was embraced by folks that we talked with consistently. And also, the state was monitoring progress towards achieving those goals that were outlined there. So it was having a plan and also implementing it to try to consider how policy was helping to meet performance. One of the challenges in Texas had to do with, so at the same time there was this plan called Closing the Gaps designed to improve attainment for the population, an effort to increase the research mission within the state. So a lot of attention to how Texas, a big, large state, needed to have more nationally recognized research universities, which from a policy perspective raises a question. So if resources are finite, how do you decide how to allocate those, improving attainment or improving research? In Washington, the title of that chapter is State Policy Leadership Vacuum. So Washington has a strong record of bachelor's degree production for those who enter the public four-year institutions. The challenge there, though, is only a relatively small share of the population is in the four-year sector. Washington has a very strong and large community and technical college system, and the community and technical colleges are dispersed widely throughout the state. If you think about the employers within Washington, there's a high demand of employers to have folks who have a bachelor's degree. So figuring out how to improve bachelor's degree production within the state is an important issue. In our study, we conclude that there are some challenges. Washington had developed a number of plans, real good at developing plans, implementation harder, right? So figuring out, you can't just have a plan, you have to figure out a way to put it forward. Washington and Texas, actually, both were, at the time of the study, moved to more control of tuition setting from the state to institutions. And as institutions were given more control over setting tuition, not surprisingly, tuition increased. Washington's also interesting, so I mentioned that the community and technical college system is large, also was considered to be very politically responsive. And so the legislature had some positive feelings towards the community college system, but still the limited transfer opportunities for folks who entered that community college system. Okay, so 5 very different stories. Now we're at the point in our study we're trying to identify, well, what lessons, right? Just be in Maryland where it's a small state and people get along. We did identify some important lessons that are broader than that. So one of the conclusions is that context does matter. So what works in Maryland is going to be different than what will work in Texas, right? So Texas is a large, decentralized type of state with a culture that values decentralization. So at the foundation of this picture is this attention to state context. A second conclusion is that policy does matter, and we identify, rather than point to any one magical policy that's going to solve the problems, we identify 3 categories of policies. 2 of these categories are designed to increase the demand for higher education. So we can increase the demand by improving the affordability of higher education, and we call that the strategic use of fiscal resources. A second way to increase the demand would be to improve the academic readiness of folks for college. And so there's a whole host of policies with regard to the preparation and movement of students through our system. There's also a category of policies that we identify that is really more relevant to the supply of higher education. So thinking about the optimization of the system capacity. And I'll talk about each of those 3 in a little bit more detail. But a third conclusion from our study is that simply having policies is not enough. So we also need to have that state policy leadership in steering of higher education towards whatever shared statewide goal is set. And we argue that that goal should be around improving attainment and closing gaps across groups. We also stress, in retrospect, if I were going to do this picture over, I would somehow try to figure out a way to stress the equity component of it. So the policies have to be oriented towards equity, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute too. And then finally, this is a feedback loop. So simply figuring out this one time is not enough because the context is continually changing. Okay, so let's talk about the context just for a few minutes. So our 5 states, like all states, vary tremendously. Our states have varying historical, political, economic, and cultural contexts. They also vary tremendously in terms of their systems and structures for higher education. And so in order to identify policies, those contextual differences have to be taken into account. For example, simply telling Georgia, get rid of the Hope Scholarship Program is not a realistic type of recommendation, even though we know that need-based financial aid is more effective towards achieving the goals we value than merit-based aid. The process of building and implementing a shared agenda for higher education will also be different in Maryland when people get along with each other and their strong commitments to education historically built in. Okay, so I'm going to talk about each of these 3 categories of policies. So the first category of policies has to do with the strategic use of available fiscal resources. So as I sort of alluded to in that earlier slide that talked about the different categories of research that's been done and identified one of those categories as research that focuses on isolating the effects of a particular policy on a particular outcome, we tend to think about policy like that, right? So when policy is established for financial aid, there's often not simultaneous consideration to tuition policy. And so part of what we try to stress is that it's important to think about how different types of fiscal policies come together to determine affordability. So affordability for college depends on how states provide funds to institutions, how tuition is determined in the states, and how states structure their financial aid policies. And all those things are also, family income in the state also matters. So that's part of that equation. We found some troubling trends in the fiscal policies in the states. So for instance, both Illinois and Washington were considered low to moderate tuition states in the early 1990s. They were also well known, as I suggested before, for their robust need-based financial aid programs. But over time, in both states, tuition increased dramatically and the financial aid programs failed to keep pace. Of our 5 states, only Maryland offered some promise. So if there are folks who are interested in understanding finance strategies for states, Maryland at the time of our study was doing some interesting things in trying to strategically link appropriations, financial aid, and tuition, and then link increases in tuition to family income in a very intentional type of way. The second category of policies has to do with the movement of students across institutions. So, one of the strengths of our higher education system is its diversity, but that's also a characteristic that contributes to some challenges. So for students who enter one institution and then decide that they want to move to another, students often experience challenges in that process of smoothly transferring and having credits accepted at both of those institutions. One potential positive development was happening in Maryland and Texas, both of whom had developed completely aligned programs in particular fields. So if a student completed an associate's degree program in education, for example, in Maryland, that degree would transfer in total to a four-year college. But that's a limited number of fields that have been aligned to date. For many students, the ability to successfully transfer credits across institutions is challenging. There are also challenges as students try to navigate their way from high school into college. So simply because you earn a high school diploma does not mean that you're going to enter college level work. We're losing many, many students in these transition points. One of the interesting things that I've puzzled over a little bit from the study is that all 5 of our states, like many other states, have established some sort of entity that's called P16, K20, some sort of entity that's designed to help bring together K through 12 and higher education. These bodies have generally not led to many policies being as a result of their coming together. One of the accomplishments that we point out in the book is that some of these groups seem, just bringing people together in the room is an accomplishment. So we have a long way to go. Another discouraging finding, especially given where we are, is some of the folks in our study, when we talked about ways to improve alignment, were putting off action until the Common Core state standards. So there's hope out there that something will happen, but clearly this is an area that needs much more progress and attention. The third category of policies has to do with what we call here optimization of system capacity. It's also, another way to think about it may be in terms of matching the educational needs of a population with the educational opportunities that are available. So all 5 of our states were struggling to figure out ways to better meet the educational needs within its own border. So for example, Texas is one large state, but within Texas, there are many different regions that have very, very different types of needs and challenges with regard to educational attainment. Some of the regions underperform with regard to academic preparation and access, and in other areas, the issues are more around college completion. So one of the observations from the study is that few states have the resources simply to build new campuses, right, in order to better serve their population. There are a number of innovations that seem to be going on within these states in order to try to figure out how to use the resources and the educational opportunities that are available to meet state needs. But some of these have some consequences that I think require some additional attention. So for example, in Washington, Washington expanded 2 research universities, the University of Washington and Washington State, through branch campuses to try to achieve that the need to increase bachelor's degree production that I mentioned earlier. But expanding capacity at your research universities is a more expensive strategy than perhaps expanding capacity of the more comprehensive institutions. Another example of a practice that is happening, and this came up in the meeting with students earlier today, is community colleges awarding bachelor's degrees. And so this is another approach that has some potential benefits, but also some things that we should be thinking about with regard to how that practice may be changing the mission of our institutions. Another observation was that none of the 5 states were talking about for-profit institutions in a way other than figuring out how to regulate them. So for-profits are certainly an entity that's out there in this space, but not a lot of strategic thinking that we found in our study at the time we were collecting data. Okay, so another central conclusion that I alluded to earlier is that policy matters, but it's not enough. All states have policies, right? So there's a lot of activity that's going on within the states. More than policy, we argue, states need a shared commitment to a goal of improving attainment and really closing the gaps in attainment. We try to push on some critical questions that we all should be considering. So to what extent will a state play a role in the future stewardship of higher education? Will states take on this responsibility as they have done historically, Or will they, by policy or default, delegate the responsibility to institutions? And it seems that more of what's happening now is this delegation of responsibility to institutions. One of the challenges, of course, is that the priorities and goals of higher education institutions are not necessarily the goals of a statewide agenda, right? Institutions have other types of incentives and other priorities that they're trying to address. Okay. And then, of course, there is our conclusion about how equity must be a priority. So individual states in our nation will not achieve the goals that we need if we don't address the different profound differences in equity that are happening right now. So our study shows the need for policies that increase the demand for higher education and the supply of higher education. We need policies that improve college affordability and academic readiness, and we also need policies that improve the availability and accessibility of higher education. But the policies that we have in place have to be oriented towards closing the gaps in opportunity. We argue that a state's failure to level the playing field for higher education has disproportionate negative implications for those who have the lowest educational attainment now, so students from the lowest family income groups, racial ethnic minorities, and others. One of the most serious issues that higher education is facing today is the insidious and growing gaps in educational opportunity and attainment based on individual characteristics. And certainly there's a lot of attention to differences across groups based on individual characteristics. What we try to point out here is that it also matters right now. Your chances in terms of higher education attainment also depend on where you live. Individual institutions, higher education institutions, have priorities other than improving higher education attainment. So to achieve the improvements that we need, we really need more focus on state policies. We need state policies that make clear the goals around improving attainment, and we also need policies that steer and guide higher education institutions towards these goals. So to remove the promise of higher education, the U.S. needs to boost educational opportunity and attainment. And we really raised at the end critical questions about the direction our country is going in with regard to these things. You know, whether it actually is in fact possible for individuals to achieve the American dream, you know, whether working hard and playing by the rules is enough. It seems very clear that opportunity is structured into our society in many different important ways, and state policy is the mechanism, we argue, that is available to try to address those issues. So thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a senior at Booster College, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about statewide testing, specifically for elementary and middle school kids, and how that might affect. Oh, sorry. I know you talked a little bit about Georgia's program of incentivizing higher test scores in K through 12 as potential financial aid or scholarships in college. But how does statewide testing in general affect issues of access in higher ed?
It's a great question. So I think it plays out in a variety of different ways. So there's a lot. So one way is that there's a lot of testing that goes on, and the tests that are in place right now are measuring different types of things. So doing well, and Scott and I actually have a paper on the role of state high school exit exams and the ways in which, so those exams are not aligned with what's required to enroll in college, right? So if you pass the state exit exam, doesn't necessarily mean you're academically qualified to enter college level work. And so there's the incentives and the questions about what we're testing for and what that feedback on a test actually tells you about your readiness to proceed to a next level. That's important. But one of the things we found in the study that we did is that tests create different types of incentives, right? And so in high schools are monitored for their performance of students on these tests, right? And so if those tests are not at the level that's appropriate for gaining level into college college level work. That's one issue. And then resources, too, we found in our study are allocated towards making sure students achieve that passing level on the test rather than to other types of activities like college-oriented types of activities. And so this was particularly an issue in the low-resource schools that we studied. Testing is interesting. You know, one of the things that some of my current work is provided me with an opportunity to look at how educational opportunity plays out in other countries. And in many other countries, your outcomes in higher education are determined based on your performance on a high school test, right? So, for example, in Ireland, the score you get on a high school test is matched with scores that are set by a college, and they're aligned by major field. And so that determines the allocation of resources and students across different types of institutions. That's a type of system that wouldn't work in the US. But it's simpler in some ways. It's one test that determines different types of allocations that way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm a first year at Pomona College, and I had a question. So I understand that you are arguing to target state policies and just getting the entire state to kind of gear themselves towards improving college affordability and access. So what do you think of individual programs within local cities that that try to achieve this? Is it an effort towards a more unified state, or do you think individual efforts that are just per city are even more problematic?
That's a good question. So we focus to some extent on state policy only in the book for conceptual clarity, right? So we're focusing very specifically on trying to understand what's happening with state policy. At the end, one of the recommendations that we offer is for more attention to the ways in which policy at different levels interacts. So we don't call out regional policy in particular, but I think that, you know, there are some interesting issues to think about how to improve educational attainment within a particular metropolitan area. Certainly within our study, we identify that, so I highlighted Maryland as a relatively strong performing state, but performance is considerably lower in Baltimore, right? In Illinois, performance is lower in Chicago than for other parts of the state. So the metropolitan areas do matter. It's also interesting in states where the metropolitan areas cross state lines. So in Philadelphia, where I live, you have relevant policy in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, right? And so I think we need to make a difference. We need to do better in so many ways on these outcomes that I think that there could be important initiatives that are happening at multiple levels. And so I think what you're suggesting could have promise. But I do think it is important to think about how policies at different levels interact. So how policy at the local level interacts with state policy, how state policy interacts with federal policy, and how state policy interacts with the policies of different institutions, higher education institutions, K through 12 institutions.
Your 5 states intentionally or not represent a mixture of red states and blue states. Do you want to make any comment about any differences between red states and blue states with regard to the criteria that you were examining?
That's a good question. So with 5 states, it's hard, I think, in that regard. So Illinois was a very depressing state to so in terms of the order that we did states, we went to Georgia first, and then we went to Illinois. And in Illinois at that time, I'm getting tired, so Rod, yes, thank you. All that was in the media. You know, there have been other governors who had had political corruption. You know, so the political aspect was tough, and as I said, we were collecting data in the height of the recession, so we almost started collecting the headlines on the newspapers in the state capitol about how dire things felt. So I think I'm not prepared to make a conclusion about red versus blue. I think that there are real questions, though, with regard to the state of political leadership for higher education. So we found quite varying differences in the resources that are available for state legislators to make informed decisions, right? So in some states where the legislators are part-time, right, a certain amount of time that they have available. We talked to some legislators who have no staff, and they're working on several different issues, right? You know when you're in an interview and the interviewee begins to ask you questions about, well, how does that really work? That there's some issues there, right? So I think there's a capacity isn't really the right word, but higher education has an obligation, I think, to help policymakers figure out some of these issues. When there are term limits, that's also something that limits some of this knowledge over time. So I think it's more than red and blue. I think there are other aspects of the system in place that are probably more important. We also found different variances in trust, right? So I mentioned Washington, high level of regard among the political folks that we talked with for the community college system. And so Washington at that time had the Student Achievement Initiative, performance funding policy in play. And we were seeing some mixed things about the effectiveness of that policy, but some of the elected officials thought, well, the community colleges are responsive, but didn't feel like the public four-year institution. They felt like they were not as coordinated and much more interested in doing their own sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a good question. Yes.
Did you find, I'm a high school teacher, and so what we see is a really strong disconnect between what the kids want versus what their guidance counselors are telling them. The guidance counselors don't seem, at least in our school, I don't know how other schools work, but we see a really strong disconnect between like the community that we serve, which is low SES and minority, and then what the counselors are telling them. So did you ever see schools, like while you were doing your studies, that were, maybe having some success with some programs where they were able to sort of bridge that gap between letting the kids know that, yeah, there's still hope, perhaps, versus discouraging them or telling them that vocational school perhaps is their only option?
Right, so we didn't look at what was happening within individual high schools in this study. I was alluding before to a study that Scott and I did. So in an earlier wave of research, we did case studies of 15 schools, 3 in each of 5 states, and they varied based on the socioeconomic status of the students who were served. So very interesting and helpful for me in understanding the role of counseling as it plays out within schools to influence opportunity. So, and some of the things that we found have there have been some changes in a problematic direction with regard to counseling since the time of that study, I think. So the ratio of students to counselors is quite high. And so in Philadelphia, where I live, in the wake of the most recent budget challenges, the folks to go first are the counselors, right? So in some schools, there are no counselors now, right? And so, and even, we found even when there were counselors in these low resource schools, so high numbers of students, and the counselors have so many other things to do other than college-related counseling, right? And so figuring out the resources that are available. I think this is a really important issue, and the students and I were talking about this earlier today. We have a system in the US where information matters, right? So I said before, the US system is so diverse, it has so many different options, but boy is it complicated, right? It's complicated to figure out what the right choice is, and it's complicated to figure out how to pay for it, right? And so I think we've recognized that information matters, but we haven't really recognized an effective way to get the right types of information to people who need it most. So if you don't happen to have parents who went to college or live in a community that has those resources embedded in it, it's really challenging to figure that out. So I think, there are many people who are serving as counselors in schools, well-intentioned, doing the best they can, often not trained in how to provide college or financial aid counseling, having a whole lot of other things on their plate, and so acting with the knowledge that they have to try to provide opportunity where they can. But it's an area that we, I think, as a society have to try to figure out, because I think people do matter in that role.
So I kind of want to piggyback off of that idea a little bit and ask you how you feel the privatization of education kind of fits into this, because even if you have, let's say, things all work out and everything's even, where states figure out a way to help increase access and equity across the board within the public system, how does the private system then fit in? Or even, talking a little bit about what you were just saying, parents have the ability to pay for private college counselors to help their student figure out all of those pathways if you have the resources available. So how does that kind of fit into this whole idea of trying to increase equity within the system, when there's kind of this side system that you can definitely jump over into at any given point if you have the resources and availability for that? So how do you see that kind of mixing in here?
Right. Have you read Lois Weiss's book, Class Warfare? So depressing from this perspective. If you haven't read it, it's really well done. It came out in the spring. She did ethnographic studies of 3 high schools and really trying to get at what's happening in high schools serving upper, middle, income kids. And she really points to the ways in which families acting quite rationally, right? Using the resources that they have to maximize opportunity for their kids, right? And that the conclusions that she has there are parallel to some that others have drawn, like Jeannie Oakes has written about this too. People who have resources are motivated to use those resources to maintain class privilege. This is the classic social reproduction issue, right? I'm not sure how to take that on. I think what we need, I don't know, I'm an optimist. I keep getting up every day to try to figure this out. I think we have to figure out how to make sure that opportunity is so different, right? So that's what's happening at one end of this continuum to influence opportunity. But what's happening, we have a very big difference right now in terms of resources. Somehow we have to figure out a way to level the playing field, or at least make the bottom not so far away from the top. I don't know. There's no way you're going to stop those who have resources to use them from advantaging their children, right? But I don't know. Maybe, I don't know how, does anybody have the solution?
Hi, my name is Allison. I go to Pitzer. So I'm curious, bringing it back to testing, what is the national or state conversation going on regarding SAT testing? Because that's a test that will get you into college, but it's also a test that costs money. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are. And yeah, and I'm just interested in the conversation happening in regards to those tests.
Mm-hmm. Well, so certainly there are many, many tests that are embedded in our system. As I said before, not aligned. So there's the college admissions test, there's the high school leaving test, there are the college placement tests that colleges have. There are test waivers available, and so one piece of information that's really important is the extent to which students, especially those from low-income families, know about the ability of waivers for tests as well as for admissions applications and other things. Those are important, but there are other sorts of fees that are built into our system too, and other sorts of things, and getting to the advantages that folks have, the ability of folks to spend money on test prep and things like that are all part of what's influencing college opportunity. There are some states where the SAT is now, the ACT is being used as the high school leaving exam, and so that may help with some of the alignment types of issues, especially if the state pays for everyone to take it, or at least builds that in. Yeah, I'm not sure. Did I get at your question?
I guess I'm just wondering if there, I mean, like, do you know in which states it's becoming kind of an accepted exit exam? Because my concern is that, like, I don't know, I'm just curious if people are concerned about that and, like, the educational policy levels. And if there's a conversation being had of, like, whether it should be a national policy to have it as the exit exam for all colleges, or whether it's unfair or doesn't promote equality.
Yeah, so there's so many different dimensions of testing. You know, certainly the questions about the fairness of tests, the ways in which tests are used in the college admissions process. You know, there's questions. You know, some colleges and universities now being test optional, and thinking about how that actually plays out. You know, I'm teaching this semester a college access course, and in the course we're partnering with folks who do college access programming in the community. And one of the questions that was posed by one of the practitioners for my students to think about is the extent to, so kind of getting at your question about what counselors tell students. So they have college students come in and do college mentoring in the high school, and one of the observations from the college students often is the set of schools that we're advised to encourage students in the high school to apply to is too narrow, right? They have bigger dreams for the students that they're mentoring. The question from the practitioner is, so what really is the realistic set of colleges that will accept a student who attends a low resource school, who has low SAT scores, with no proven record of students from this high school going into that school and being acceptable? Will test optional schools really take these kids? You know, I think there are more things to be learned about how tests are being used, how they could be used better, and then the whole host of questions that are related to that. You know, how do we define merit? Are there other ways to think about that really get at some of the different types of contributions that and aptitudes that folks have?
Dr. Perna?
Yes.
I have a question about a bar chart I think you had very early, where you were indicating the quartiles of income and the lowest and the colleges, the types of colleges that they went to. Mm-hmm. And I attend Claremont Graduate University, which is a small private university, and I work at a small private university in Burbank. And we have I think the last count we had was 70% first generation students that came to our private institution. So what confused me was your bar chart, and like I said, maybe I did not see it right, mm-hmm. but it looked like 50% of the lowest quartile students were going to for-profit universities. So of course the first thing I think of is University of Phoenix or something like that.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit more, about if you just uncovered why that would be, why the financial dynamics of that is more effective for a lower income student?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So the second row from the bottom says that 45% of the students who attend a for-profit institution are, so 45% of the financially dependent students who attend a for-profit institution are from the lowest income quartile. And so at the other end, you pointed out, so 18% of the students attending the private not-for-profit four-year institutions are from the lowest income quartile. Clearly differences across institutions. So again, these are, that doesn't mean that at all private not-for-profit four-year institutions, low-income students are such a small percentage. There clearly are variations within that group. In terms of the representation of low-income students. So in some sense, those are averages. There has been attention to the relative concentration of students from low-income families in the for-profit institutions. So some would suggest that may be attributable to the ways in which for-profit institutions market themselves to students. There may be something with regard to the accessibility of for-profit institutions, when classes are offered, the locations of the institutions, those sorts of things. It's, in some senses, it's hard to figure out. And when you look at the sticker price, oftentimes those are high at the for-profit institutions, but there is good, at many for-profit institutions, there may be assistance with applying for financial aid and facilitating some of that process. I think it's something that needs more, there may be something that higher education, traditional higher education can learn about how for-profit institutions, how and why they're attracting students from low-income families. And then there are also some reasons why we should be paying more attention to the sector too in terms of outcomes. So completion rates are often low at the for-profit institutions, the borrowing rates are high, and the amounts borrowed are high. So it's a sector that's important to pay attention to. Only still about, I think it's 12% of undergraduate students are at for-profit institutions, but it's an increasing share over time. Yeah. One more? Yes.
I guess that's me. So I know your research focuses on educational policy and how it can, how to fill the higher education gap that exists. But I think that with that, we do need to recognize that academic limitations do exist for students of color, for marginalized populations, and specifically, we need to pay attention to the school-to-prison pipeline that exists for students of color. So what do you think of educational policies that can consider addressing those limitations by considering critical education perspectives? So for example, ethnic studies right now is being approved across California. So those are examples of where curriculums are introducing marginalized students to those limitations that exist for them so that they can be aware of them. Because honestly, educational policies are not universal for students of low SES backgrounds and high SES backgrounds.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I haven't looked much at those types of policies. I've tried to focus more on understanding the resources that are available in different types of high schools. So, for example, I had a study, I was sort of being critical of studies before that look at the effects of particular types of policies on particular outcomes. That being said, I've done studies on those sorts of things. One of the relatively recent studies I did was looking at the availability of international baccalaureate programs across schools. So IB has had a stated push to try to make that curriculum. So for those of you who don't maybe not know about it, so kind of like advanced placement, but a whole curriculum designed to provide a more seamless transition into college, a more quote-unquote academically rigorous type of curriculum. Anyhow, a stated push by IB to make it more available to students from low-income families and racial ethnic minority groups. So our study was designed to look at, well, what are the trends in the availability of IB across schools and among the characteristics of students who take it. And we found, so IB is available in more diverse schools over time, but even within school, the characteristics of the schools themselves have gotten more diverse over time faster than the characteristics of students who are taking IB, right? So there are two dimensions that suggest for me, right? So one is the extent to which schools have the resources to offer rigorous curriculum. And then the second issue is the extent to which students within a school that even if it has that rigorous curriculum has the opportunity to participate in what's available, right? So, I think there are multiple dimensions on this. I used Philadelphia as an example before. We have some high schools in Philadelphia where there are no advanced placement courses, right? And so that's very different than the high school my kids attend, or there's just a vast difference in those types of resources. So those are the sorts of things I've tried to pay more attention to, but I certainly will look forward to learning more about the types of policies that you suggest there. I think we certainly, we're doing a lot of things right now, and we don't have the outcomes that we really want. So trying to think differently about how to make a difference on these issues is really important. Good, thanks. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank all of you in the audience. Before we say thank you finally to Laura and goodbye, a couple of acknowledgments. First, all of the graduate students in the audience, regardless of your affiliation, please raise your hand. Fabulous. Undergraduates, 5Cs and otherwise?
Oh, wow.
Great to see you guys. Welcome. As I looked around the audience from up front, I want to call attention to a couple of people. I've already acknowledged Jack and Daryl, of course. This is Daryl's lecture. But Tom Lashai, who we acknowledged earlier. Laura had said hello to Professor Deborah Faye Carter. Professor Angela Locks is with us. Hello, Angela. It's great to see you. Professor Nancy Acevedo Gill is with us. Welcome, Nancy. Great to see you. Professor Roberta Espinoza. Fantastic to see you. Good evening. And we have Professor Rogers, Dr. Rogers, excuse me, with us in the back, an alum from some years ago. And on the other end of that continuum, and I'm not dating you at all, Sharon, is Dr. Greg Richardson, who has recently completed his degree. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm trying to find the booby prize underneath the cabinet. I come up with a plastic cup. I can do better than that, Laura. There we go, a fancy Claremont Graduate University mug.
Thank you.
Laura Perna, colleague, friend, contributor to so many things that are important for bettering society and championing the principles that are important to so many of us in this room tonight. I want to thank you for coming from Philadelphia to be with us tonight and to help honor the legacy of Daryl Smith in her continued work. And thank you, Laura, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good night. Have a great night. Be safe out there. Thanks.